The city bus moved slowly through the streets, stopping every few blocks to pick up more passengers. It was early morning, and most people on the bus looked tired. Some were on their way to work, while others were heading home after a long night shift. In the middle of the bus, Harold Madsen, a grumpy-looking man in his late 50s, sat near the front in a priority seat. He wore a wrinkled jacket and had a permanent scowl on his face. His arms were crossed, and his eyes stared out the window as if he had no interest in the people around him. Standing near the front was Maya Patel, a young nurse in her late 20s. She held onto a metal pole for balance as the bus moved. She had just finished a long shift at the hospital, and her legs ached. Her dark hair was tied back, and dark circles under her eyes showed how exhausted she was. She glanced at the crowded seats, but didn't complain. She was used to standing. More people got on the bus at each stop. A mother with a small child squeezed into a corner. A man in a suit checked his phone. A group of teenagers whispered and laughed in the back. The bus was completely full when it reached the next stop. As the doors opened, an elderly man slowly climbed aboard. His dark brown skin was lined with age, and he leaned on a wooden cane for support. His name was Mr. Lewis, and he had been riding this bus for years. He wore a neatly pressed shirt and a hat that sat low over his kind eyes. The bus jolted forward, making Mr. Lewis stumble slightly. He gripped the nearest handle, his old hands shaking as he tried to stay steady. The driver noticed and called out, "Is there a seat for the gentleman?" Maya turned her head, expecting someone to move. She glanced at the priority seats, where Harold sat comfortably. Harold looked straight ahead, pretending not to hear. A few people on the bus exchanged awkward glances. They knew those seats were meant for elderly or disabled passengers. Yet, no one wanted to be the first to speak up. One young man near Harold hesitated, then finally said, "Sir, could you let him sit?" Harold scoffed and shook his head. "Not my problem," he muttered. The bus fell silent. The mother with her child frowned. A man near the back let out an annoyed sigh, but still, no one forced Harold to move. Maya felt anger rising inside her. She had spent all night helping sick and injured people, people of all backgrounds. And here was this man, refusing to move 2 feet for someone who clearly needed the seat more than he did. Mr. Lewis, still holding onto the handle, gave a tired smile. "It's all right," he said politely. "I can stand." But Maya knew it wasn't all right, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass without saying something. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and prepared to speak. Maya tightened her grip on the metal pole as the bus moved forward. The air inside felt heavy, filled with unspoken tension. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Harold Madsen, the grumpy man in the priority seat, had refused to move for an elderly man who clearly needed to sit. Mr. Lewis still stood, gripping the handle tightly. His cane wobbled slightly as the bus hit a small bump. His old hand shook, but he didn't complain. He just nodded politely, as if this kind of thing had happened before. Maya's tired body begged her to stay quiet, to let it go. She had just worked a long shift at the hospital. She was exhausted, and arguing with a stranger wasn't how she wanted to start her morning. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore this. She took a step closer to Harold and spoke firmly. "Sir, this seat is meant for elderly or disabled passengers. He needs it more than you do." Harold didn't even look at her. He just let out a loud sigh and crossed his arms. "Not my problem," he muttered again, his voice colder this time. Maya felt her frustration grow. "It is your problem. You're sitting in a seat that's meant for people like him." Harold finally turned his head and glared at her. His face was red with anger. "I got here first," he snapped. "Why don't you mind your own business?" A few passengers turned to watch. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed interested, waiting to see what would happen next. A man sitting across the aisle shook his head. "Come on, man," he said to Harold. "It's just a seat." A woman with glasses added, "Yeah, don't be like that. Let him sit." Harold's scowl deepened. He looked around, realizing that people were starting to speak up. But instead of moving, he dug in his heels. "I'm not moving for anybody," he grumbled. "I paid for my ticket just like everyone else." Maya's hands clenched into fists. She couldn't believe how stubborn he was being. She glanced at Mr. Lewis, who was still standing quietly. He wasn't asking for a fight. He just needed a little kindness. Maya took a deep breath, trying to control her anger. "This isn't about who paid for what," she said, her voice calmer now but still firm. "It's about doing the right thing." Harold snorted. "The right thing? Give me a break." The bus driver, who had been watching through the mirror, finally spoke up. His voice boomed through the speakers. "Sir, if you don't give up that seat, you'll have to get off at the next stop." A ripple of whispers spread through the passengers. Some nodded in agreement. Others simply watched, waiting to see what Harold would do. Harold's jaw tightened. He looked at the driver, then at the people around him. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Maya didn't move. She wasn't going to back down. The whole bus was waiting for his decision. The bus moved forward, but inside, the tension felt heavier than ever. People were no longer just ignoring what was happening. They were watching, waiting for Harold to make a decision. Harold shifted in his seat, his face still tight with anger. He didn't like being called out in front of all these people. He had taken that seat first, so why should he have to move? In his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. Mr. Lewis, still gripping the metal pole, gave a tired smile. "Young lady, it's all right," he said softly to Maya. "I've been standing all my life. I can stand a little longer." But Maya wasn't willing to let it go. She had seen too much unfairness in the world to stay silent. "That's not the point," she said. "You shouldn't have to stand when there's a seat right there." Harold scoffed. "Oh, come on." He said. "He's fine. Why are you making a big deal out of nothing?" Maya stared at him, disbelief in her eyes. "It's not nothing. You just don't want to move." The other passengers were listening closely now. A young man near the back muttered, "Unbelievable." The woman with glasses frowned. "It's not that hard to do the right thing," she said. Harold folded his arms, looking straight ahead. "I don't owe anyone anything," he muttered. The bus driver had had enough. He slowed the bus and pulled over to the side of the road. Then he turned around in his seat, looking straight at Harold. "Sir, I told you once already. You can either move or get off my bus." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Others just waited to see what Harold would do. For the first time, Harold looked unsure. He glanced around and realized that no one was on his side. People were shaking their heads, whispering to each other. The whole bus was against him. He could feel his face burning. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Usually, people just let things go, but not today. Harold sighed loudly, as if he were the victim in all this. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up from the seat. "Fine," he grumbled, "if it'll shut everyone up." Maya stepped aside as he shuffled toward the back of the bus, his face still full of anger. He dropped into another seat and stared out the window, refusing to look at anyone. As soon as he moved, another passenger quickly helped Mr. Lewis to the now empty seat. The old man smiled and sat down with a relieved sigh. "Thank you, young lady," he said to Maya. "You didn't have to do that." Maya smiled back. "Yes, I did." The bus started moving again. The air felt lighter, the tension slowly fading away. Some passengers exchanged small nods, as if silently agreeing that they had just witnessed something important. Harold stayed quiet in the back, his arms crossed tightly. He still didn't think he had done anything wrong, but deep down, something about the way people had reacted stuck with him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as right as he thought he was. The bus rolled forward, the sounds of the city filling the air again. People shifted in their seats, some looking at their phones, others staring out the window. But no one had forgotten what had just happened. Harold sat at the back now, his arms crossed, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. His face was still red with anger, but he said nothing. He didn't like how the whole bus had turned against him. Meanwhile, Mr. Lewis sat in his new seat, resting his hands on his cane. He looked tired, but there was a small smile on his face. He was grateful, not just for the seat, but for the fact that someone had stood up for him. Maya let out a quiet breath. She had done the right thing, but something still bothered her. It wasn't just Harold's behavior. It was how long it had taken for someone to say something. At first, everyone had just watched. People had avoided eye contact, stayed quiet, or acted like it wasn't their problem. If no one had spoken up, Harold would still be sitting there, and Mr. Lewis would still be standing. Why did it take so long for people to act? Maya glanced around at the other passengers. Some were still looking at Harold with disapproval, but most had already moved on. She knew how easy it was to stay silent, to pretend not to see something wrong happening. A woman sitting nearby, the one with glasses, leaned over and whispered, "You did the right thing." Maya smiled. "Thanks." The woman sighed. "I wanted to say something, but I don't know. I just didn't." Maya understood. It was always easier to wait for someone else to speak first, but what if no one ever did? The young man who had first asked Harold to move spoke up now. "I should have been louder about it. I saw it happening, but I thought someone else would handle it." Maya nodded. "It happens to all of us. But if we don't step in, nothing changes." The woman with glasses gave a thoughtful nod. "You're right. We can't just sit and watch." At the back of the bus, Harold shifted in his seat, still pretending not to hear, but his grip on his jacket tightened. The words being spoken around him weren't just about him. They were about something bigger. As the bus moved on, Maya looked at Mr. Lewis. He sat quietly, his eyes closed, as if enjoying the moment of rest. He had probably experienced situations like this before, maybe too many times. Maya made a promise to herself right then. If she ever saw something unfair again, she wouldn't wait for someone else to fix it. She would act. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person to break the silence. The bus continued moving through the city, stopping every few blocks to let people on and off. But inside, the atmosphere was still tense. Some passengers tried to go back to their usual routine, but others kept glancing toward the back, where Harold sat in silence. Maya leaned against a metal pole, still thinking about what had just happened. She had stood up for Mr. Lewis, and others had eventually spoken too. But what if no one had? The thought made her uneasy. Mr. Lewis shifted in his seat, adjusting his cane beside him. He looked over at Maya and gave her a warm smile. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said. Maya smiled back. "Oh yeah." He nodded. "She's just like you. Always standing up for what's right." He sighed and shook his head. "You'd be surprised how many times I've been in situations like this. People don't always see it, but I notice. I notice who speaks up and who stays quiet." Maya felt a pang in her chest. "I'm sorry that this still happens." Mr. Lewis waved a hand. "Oh, don't be sorry, young lady. Be proud. You didn't stay quiet." Just then, the bus driver spoke again through the intercom. "Next stop, Oakwood Avenue." A few passengers stood up to get ready to leave, but instead of walking toward the door, one young man made his way toward the back of the bus, toward Harold. Maya and a few others watched curiously. The young man was in his early 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He looked confident but calm. He stopped right in front of Harold and crossed his arms. Harold glanced up at him, frowning. "What do you want?" The young man didn't flinch. "I just want to say something before I get off this bus." Harold rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go." The young man ignored the comment. "You acted like it wasn't a big deal, but everyone on this bus saw what happened. You had a choice, to do something kind or to be selfish, and you chose wrong." Harold let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah, and what are you gonna do about it?" The young man shook his head. "Nothing. Because it's not about me, it's about you." Harold's smirk faded slightly. The young man continued, "You think this moment doesn't matter. It does. People remember things like this. You might not care, but we do. And you know what? You're gonna remember it too." The bus was silent. Even the people who had been looking at their phones were now paying attention. Harold clenched his jaw. "You done?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, I'm done." He turned and walked toward the exit, but just before he stepped off, he called out, "I hope next time you make a better choice." Then he disappeared onto the sidewalk. The doors closed, and the bus continued moving. Maya looked at Harold. He was still sitting stiffly, his hands balled into fists. He didn't say anything, but something had changed in his expression. Maybe, just maybe, the words had reached him. The bus rolled forward, but the air inside was still thick with tension. After the young man had spoken to Harold and left, No one had said a word. It was as if the whole bus was waiting to see if Harold would react, if he would defend himself, or if he would finally understand what had just happened. Harold sat stiffly in his seat, his arms crossed tightly. He stared out the window, but his mind wasn't on the passing buildings. The young man's words echoed in his head. You had a choice, to do something kind or to be selfish, and you chose wrong. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. People usually just ignored him or mumbled complaints under their breath. But today, someone had called him out. Not just one person, several. Harold shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Maya watched him from her spot near the front. She wasn't expecting an apology. She wasn't even expecting him to admit he was wrong. But she could tell something was happening inside his head. Mr. Lewis, now sitting comfortably in the seat Harold had refused to give up, let out a small sigh and glanced toward the back. His voice was calm but steady when he spoke. You know, son, I've been around a long time, he said, and I've learned that the hardest thing for a man to do is admit when he's wrong. Harold's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Mr. Lewis continued, his voice kind but firm. I'm not mad at you. I'm not even upset. I've met men like you before, good men, deep down, but too proud to see when they've made a mistake. A few passengers turned to listen. Even Maya leaned in slightly. Harold finally looked away from the window. I didn't do anything wrong, he muttered. Mr. Lewis smiled faintly. Maybe not in your eyes. But ask yourself this, was it really that hard to give up that seat? Harold swallowed. He didn't answer. The woman with glasses, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up now. You sat in that seat for a long time, knowing it was meant for people like him. And when people asked you to move, you refused. She shook her head. That says something. Harold frowned. Yeah. And what does it say? The woman looked at him carefully. That maybe you're not as kind as you think you are. Silence filled the bus again. Harold felt heat rise to his face. He wanted to argue, to tell them they were wrong, that he was just minding his own business. But deep down, he knew the truth. For years, he had told himself he was a good person, just tough, just independent. But today, he had been selfish, and now the whole bus had seen it. The bus driver announced the next stop, and a few people stood to leave. Harold sat still, his mind racing. He didn't like how he felt right now, but for the first time in a long time, he started to wonder. Maybe, just maybe, he really had been wrong. The bus continued its journey through the city, but inside, Harold sat in silence. The words of the young man, the woman with glasses, and Mr. Lewis echoed in his mind. That maybe you're not as kind as you think you are. Was it really that hard to give up that seat? Harold didn't like the way those words made him feel. For years, he had lived his life a certain way, keeping to himself, doing what he wanted, and not worrying about others. But now, for the first time, he was starting to wonder if he had been wrong. He glanced at Mr. Lewis, who was now sitting peacefully in the seat he had refused to give up. The old man didn't look angry. In fact, he looked almost understanding. Harold cleared his throat. He wasn't good at apologizing. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he had ever said sorry to anyone. He hesitated, then mumbled, I didn't think it was a big deal. Mr. Lewis turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. What's that, son? Harold sighed. Talking about feelings wasn't something he did, but something inside him told him he needed to say it. I didn't think it was a big deal, he repeated, a little louder this time. I guess I just didn't think about it. Maya, who was still standing nearby, folded her arms. That's the problem, she said. A lot of people don't think about it. Harold looked at her. He wanted to snap back, to defend himself, but he stopped, because she was right. He hadn't thought about it. Mr. Lewis nodded slowly. I believe you, he said, but thinking about it now, do you see why it mattered? Harold shifted in his seat. He wasn't sure what to say. Mr. Lewis continued, his voice gentle. Son, I've lived a long life, and one thing I know for sure is that kindness doesn't cost a thing. A little respect, a little consideration, it goes a long way. Harold stared at the floor. He didn't like being called out, But this didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a lesson. A moment of silence passed. Then, to everyone's surprise, Harold let out a long sigh and muttered, "I guess I messed up." Maya raised an eyebrow. "You think?" A few passengers chuckled softly, and even Mr. Lewis smiled. Harold rubbed his face with one hand. "Yeah, all right, I get it." He looked at Mr. Lewis. "I should have moved." The old man nodded. That's all anyone wanted to hear. Harold sat back in his seat. He still felt embarrassed, but for the first time, he wasn't angry. Maybe, just maybe, this was a moment he would remember. Maybe, next time, he would make a different choice. The bus moved forward, the city passing by in a blur of buildings, streetlights, and people. Inside, the tension had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. Harold sat in the back, staring at his hands. He wasn't sure how to feel. Embarrassed? Frustrated? Maybe both. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite explain. He had never thought much about his actions before. He had always lived by his own rules, doing what was best for him. But today, for the first time in a long time, he had been forced to look at himself in a different way. He glanced at Mr. Lewis, who sat calmly in his seat, looking out the window. The old man had been nothing but kind, even after everything. He hadn't yelled, hadn't called Harold names. He had just talked to him. And somehow, that had made all the difference. Maya, still standing nearby, watched Harold carefully. She could see that something had shifted in him. He wasn't the same stubborn man who had refused to move just minutes ago. He was thinking now. The bus driver announced the next stop, and a few passengers stood up. Mr. Lewis grabbed his cane and began to rise. Harold blinked. Wait. The word slipped out before he could stop it. Mr. Lewis turned, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, son." Harold hesitated, then quickly stood up. "Take my seat." The entire bus seemed to pause for a moment. Maya's eyebrows shot up in surprise. A few passengers exchanged looks. Even the woman with glasses smiled slightly. Mr. Lewis chuckled. "Well now, that's very kind of you." Harold shrugged, trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. "Yeah, well, I guess I am thinking about it now." The old man patted Harold's shoulder before sitting down. "That's all anyone can ask, son." Harold moved toward the front of the bus, standing near Maya. He could feel her looking at him, but he refused to meet her eyes. Finally, she smirked. "Took you long enough." Harold sighed. Yeah, but there was no anger in his voice, just acceptance. As the bus pulled up to the next stop, Mr. Lewis turned and gave Harold one last smile. "You'll remember this moment," he said simply. "And next time, you won't need anyone to remind you." Harold didn't respond, but deep down he knew the old man was right. As Mr. Lewis stepped off the bus and disappeared into the crowd, Harold let out a breath. Maybe today hadn't gone the way he expected. Maybe it had been uncomfortable. But maybe, just maybe, it had been exactly what he needed.